I really am genuinely really excited about where energy storage is heading, and I think it will be the technology of the century. Like I've said the word game changer, I've probably used that so many times, but I really do think it is. And the advances we're seeing in batteries, particularly, and in other forms of energy storage are just mind-blowing to me.
This is The Energy Canvas, bringing energy solutions to life. With your host, Celtic Dynamics CEO, Dylan Walsh.
Hey, Dylan here. Today we're looking at one of the most important but often overlooked parts of energy transition, energy storage. As renewable energy grows, storing electricity and managing when it's used is becoming critical to how our energy system works. Joining me is Bobby Smith, Director of Energy Storage Ireland, representing energy storage across Ireland and Northern Ireland. We'll talk about the role of energy storage in Ireland's energy system, the technologies shaping the sector, and the opportunities and challenges ahead. Hi, Bobby. Welcome to the Energy Canvas.
Hi, Dylan. Thanks very much for having me.
So I suppose to start us off, when people hear the term energy storage, what does that actually mean maybe for Ireland?
Yeah, absolutely. So energy storage is really any technology or device that can store electricity at a point in time and shift it to another. So like typically you think of like a battery in your phone or a laptop or an EV, like you're putting energy into that in the form of electricity. It's then converting that into a useful form of energy. In the case of energy storage, like we're taking in electricity from the grid or direct from wind farms or solar farms, holding that energy until like there's more useful time to use it later on in the day or in the next day, whatever.
If I was someone who was thinking of getting into energy storage, what do we see as like an important part for Ireland's energy transition?
I often describe energy storage as like a game changer because traditionally we haven't been able to store electricity. It was use it or lose it. Now, I have to caveat that by saying like there has been energy storage for a while in the form of pumped hydro. So if anyone's familiar with Turlock Hill in County Wicklow, it's a pumped hydro facility, which means basically it stores energy in water reservoirs. But that technology has been quite limited in terms of its application in Ireland. Like you need particular geography for it. So we really haven't been able to store electricity in bulk until now with the advent of like things like batteries and other forms of energy storage coming onto the scene. What that means is like when you have a system that's increasingly going to be dominated by wind and solar electricity. So Ireland has really ambitious targets in wind and solar. We already get around nearly 40% of our electricity today from renewable sources, mostly wind. But our solar electricity is really ramping up like rooftop and utility scale. Wind, we're going to be developing offshore wind, in the coming, years as well off the east coast and the south coast of Ireland. And that's going to bring with it obviously good things in terms of a lot of a clean, Irish-made indigenous renewable electricity, but it also brings challenges in terms of variability because you can imagine, we're dependent then on weather patterns, whether it's sunny or windy for where we're getting most of our electricity. So what happens when it's not as windy or when it's nighttime, when we don't have solar, or winter evenings peak when we don't have solar again? How do we move electricity in bulk from renewables to address those time periods? Because right now we're relying on gas mostly to address that. That brings problems because we're reliant on imported fuels for our gas. And you're seeing right now with the Iran crisis, how those, it's very volatile, those international prices for fuels that we import. We saw it even worse in terms of the Ukraine crisis a few years ago. So how do we get off that? And obviously burning that gas generation, emits carbon emission, which is obviously negative for the environment. And we want to get off that as quickly as we can. So being able to store more of our renewable electricity, let's say at the times when we have excess, or when the grid isn't able to take it, and shift at the times when otherwise we'd be relying on gas, is a game changer for the system. And luckily today, with the advances in battery technology and new energy storage technologies, we're able to do that much more effectively and efficiently than we have in the past. So it really is changing the system for the better.
Yeah, so I suppose if we were just talking technology, then what's the current one? I've heard of solid state, I've heard of different types of batteries and stuff. What's the current one everyone's trying to chase after?
Yeah, like the current kind of dominant technology is lithium-ion batteries. It's a very familiar technology. In terms of utility scale storage, like bulk storage, it's quite new. But the basic technology has been around for about 50 years. We use it in lots of our applications in our daily lives. Like everyone has it in their home in terms of like appliances, their mobile phones, their laptops, and now increasingly in electric vehicles. And it's basically a lithium-ion battery chemistry. It's not solid state. It uses a liquid electrolyte. The lithium batteries that are most common today in terms of utility scale storage are what's known as lithium iron phosphate, or LFP. They use basically iron, phosphate, and lithium as their core components. And most of the batteries come from Asia. Most of them come from China, indeed, some South Korea. And what we've really seen those countries being able to do is kind of revolutionize the efficiency and the ability of these batteries to store vast amounts of energy. So 10 years ago, it would have been unthinkable that a battery, a lithium battery, would have been able to store electricity in large volumes, enough to power a home or power like a town or even power a country potentially for a matter of time. Now with the advances in battery technology, become much more efficient and effective. So just give you kind of a reference, the cost of lithium ion batteries has declined about 90% in the last 10 years. Their efficiency has more than, I'd say, quadrupled in that time. You can put about 4 times the amount of energy into the same container than you could about 10 years ago. And that's only going to keep going. We're not even reaching the ceiling of it yet. And then there are other advanced technology in lithium ion like solid state that will improve that process even further. There's other forms of battery chemistry that are being talked about. So sodium ion batteries, basically using salt instead of lithium. It's a simple process of switching it in and out, is another technology that's seen as potentially viable to, move the needle even further. And then, like I should say, in Energy Storage Ireland, we represent all forms of energy storage. So we're a representative association. I have no skin in the game in terms of a particular development or a particular technology. We just represent energy storage technologies in general. And we're trying to advocate for, the development of energy storage in Ireland as a key enabler of our clean energy transition. So in that respect, we represent lithium-ion battery developers. We represent, potential solid-state lithium-ion battery developers. We represent developers of other forms of energy storage. So to give you two that are, I think, pretty interesting and are developing in Ireland. So there's one being developed in County Offaly by a company called Energy Dome. And that is a form of CO2 battery. So essentially, it looks like a large white dome. Like if you've seen one of those indoor tennis or indoor like five-side football things, it's almost in a white like a canvas dome. It almost looks like that. It's storing CO2 in compressed form. It's running that through a generator to form energy storage. And then there's a company called Form Energy, which uses iron and air as its basic chemistry for energy storage. So iron, air, and water. And that's being developed in County Donegal. And that's particularly interesting as you can actually store and discharge energy for 100 hours, which is about 4 days of energy, which is quite a lot. Your lithium-ion batteries today will do about 6 to 8 hours of storage duration. Like they'll be able to export their full capacity for about 6 to 8 hours, whereas some of these newer technologies like the energy domes and the iron airs are able to do, between 20 to 100 hours, for instance. So it's kind of changing again the game in terms of, we have imbalances in wind and solar electricity that might last for days. Like during a winter low period of wind generation, you might not have sufficient wind electricity for a period of multiple days or even a week. So where do you get your electricity from during those times? Right now it's gas, but with the likes of, iron air technology, advances in batteries, we're able to cover more of those periods and reduce our reliance on gas generation.
Yeah. Would electrolysis into hydrogen then count as energy storage too? Yeah.
It does count as energy storage. Yes, it does. And again, we represent that being technology agnostic. It's really just saying, if we have the right sort of supportive environment for different technologies in Ireland, the right market is there, the best technologies will win. Technologies that provide the most value, that can deliver at the lowest cost, that can deliver the quickest will win ultimately. And again, I have no skin in the game in terms of what that is. But yeah, electrolysis, converting essentially water to hydrogen, is a form of energy storage. There are lots of different use cases potentially for like green hydrogen. It was a few years ago, it was commonly talked about as being, ubiquitous in everything from just replacing existing gas generation. I think that has changed a lot in terms of what hydrogen can and can't do. It's quite expensive to generate. It's not easy to store. So it's sort of like a high value product. The thinking now is to use it in areas that are very hard to abate, where you already use hydrogen and you need to use kind of, let's say, fossil fuel based hydrogen, and you want to replace that with green hydrogen. People talk about cement and ammonia production, for instance. That would be kind of some of the core industries to do that. You can use it for energy storage for power generation. If you can store hydrogen in large enough volumes in tanks or in underground caverns, you can just use it to run it through a generator and generate electricity. It would be expensive to do that, so you might not want to use it all that frequently, but it could be, you could think of it almost as like a strategic reserve. Energy storage is not one form of technology, and it doesn't do just one thing. There are different almost buckets of like flexibility that energy storage provides to the system. You can think of like very near-term flexibility. The power system runs stably when supply and demand are perfectly balanced. If you have any imbalance in supply or demand, let's say, this happens not infrequently, that one of our older gas generators, which are, they tend to be about 10, 20 years old on average, they can run into mechanical issues, can disconnect from the system all of a sudden if it has an issue. That causes frequency imbalance because suddenly you got less supply than demand. And if that's not contained, it can basically lead to other generators disconnecting from the system because, if the frequency is imbalanced, those generators might disconnect to protect their own equipment. That's how, systems lead to blackout eventually. It's what happened in Spain where you had this kind of cascade of events recently where a lot of generators had to disconnect from the system. You've got a countrywide blackout. So to prevent that happening, you need very immediate flexibility in the system. And batteries are very good at providing that because a battery, if it's charged, a lithium-ion battery, for instance, if it has a charge, it can respond in milliseconds to one of these system issues. It can detect the frequency on the grid. If the frequency is imbalanced, if supply and demand is imbalanced, it'll inject power immediately to help arrest that. So if supply is low, it'll inject supply to make up that shortfall. Batteries are very good at doing that, and that's what a lot of the batteries in the system today do. And that's very important because it allows the system to operate a bit more stably with more wind and solar generation, because EirGrid, our transmission system operator, they have a really ambitious program to integrate more wind and solar electricity onto our grid. But if you're doing that, the system can be unbalanced at times. So you need something to balance it in very immediate timeframes. And batteries are great at doing that. The other buckets are sort of that medium to long-term flexibility. So let's think of solar more. Solar is a good example here. Solar electricity peaks in the daytime when the sun is at its highest. It starts to drop off in the evening, and then obviously it's not generating at night. So you can think of a battery paired with solar, and if that peak of the solar at the daytime is almost excess of what the demand is, you might have battery and solar in your own home, or people listening might have that. You're not using a lot of your solar daytime electricity because you're sort of generating excess than what you need. If you have a battery to capture that excess, then you can shift it towards the evening or the night and use the electricity yourself instead of losing it or exporting it to the grid. That's essentially what the same thing at a grid scale it works. So you have battery compared with solar, you're sort of balancing within the day. So you maybe have a battery system that can store about 4 hours of that solar energy over the daytime peak and then shift that to the evening. That's sort of your medium-term flexibility. And then we have very long-term flexibility, which is where hydrogen might play a part, where you have what the Germans call the Dunkelflaute, which is a lovely word. It's basically a 2 or 3 week period where you have very low renewable output. It tends to happen about once or twice a year. If you've got like a weather front, a low pressure weather front across Europe, just be hardly any wind for a week or two. And because it's generally they tend to happen in winter, you're not getting a lot of solar electricity. So how do you cover that sort of gap in generation and not rely on fossil fuels? Hydrogen is or some sort of biogas is seen as the solution there because you can store it in large volumes. And because it's expensive to sort of produce, you don't want to use it all that often. So you might use it once or twice a year to cover those periods. So there's sort of different buckets of energy storage and they all solve like a different problem, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, there's a few things then that come to mind in that in terms of like, I know you've worked previously in grid policy and DS3 and all that kind of stuff. How would the policy kind of be shaped in Ireland for this? Everything's fair game, or is there barriers, or what's happening at the moment?
Yeah, it's a mixed bag. I would say we were one of the early adopters of battery storage in Ireland. And one of the programs I worked on when I was in the regulator back in 2017 was the development of DS3, which is essentially an ancillary. They're called ancillary services. Every country in the world has them. They're basically those services that help balance the system in very short-term timeframes. So things like frequency response, energy reserves, those are the kind of products we were designing in the regulator and EirGrid at the time. And then we would open these up to the market to different providers like batteries, like thermal generators, like wind farms to provide these services, basically creating a market for it. And that sort of service is the very millisecond injections, that the batteries provide into the grid to help balance supply and demand in very short timeframes. So I was involved in that, and we developed that market. I think it went live in 2019, and it was world leading at the time because we were looking for very fast speed of responses. So Ireland, being an island system, we are more exposed to, let's say, system imbalances than other countries. Like in mainland Europe, let's say Germany or France or Poland, they're very heavily interconnected. Their systems are almost like as one. Rather than separate power systems, they kind of operate almost like one single system. So they can share a lot of their own resource with each other. Whereas Ireland, being an island on the periphery of Europe, we don't really have that luxury. We do have some interconnection with Great Britain, and we're planning one with France, but it's not really sufficient to cover all our balancing needs. We're more dependent on our own indigenous resources than other European countries. For that reason, we developed DS3 system services in 2019, which was asking for very enhanced capability from batteries. Because we are in the periphery of Europe as an exposed system, we need that capability. So it was a really attractive market at the time, and we've seen 1 gigawatt of batteries connected to the system that are now providing these DS3 system services, because there was a market there that paid them for a valuable service that gave them, I think, 6 or 7 years of certainty to develop on the grid. And so it was a really successful framework that delivered a lot of battery storage, which is really integral now in helping keep the lights on and helping us integrate more renewable electricity onto our system. Where we're slowing down a bit now is the sort of next stage of energy storage evolution. So what you might think of as buying low and selling high in the energy market is called energy arbitrage. So if you're familiar with the energy markets, you might know that we have a wholesale electricity market, and the price for electricity varies pretty much every half hour. Yeah, and that price is set by the merit order and the marginal generator, but essentially it varies a lot throughout the day. Like you'd have your lowest prices overnight typically, or when the wind generation is high, and then your highest price at the evening peak when demand is high. And batteries sort of make use of that because they're able to charge, when the price is low, and then discharge when the price is high, and make the difference in that spread. So if they're buying at 10 and selling at 50, they make €40, profit essentially. That's a useful service because to do that, they will obviously buy when demand is low, so the grid is less congested, or when the renewables are high, so they're sort of soaking up renewables that would otherwise be lost. And then they're discharging at the evening peak, which is typically when we'd have to bring on our more expensive gas generators to meet that evening peak. So the batteries are sort of competing with them and displacing them, driving down that evening peak price and kind of smoothing out the price volatility in the day. And that energy arbitrage market was, until very recently, effectively closed to batteries in Ireland, which was not a good situation. We were sort of an outlier in terms of other European countries when you looked at how batteries could fairly participate in the market. The reason why we had that situation was our transmission system operator, EirGrid's systems, just weren't designed for batteries. I think more complex than that, but that's the simple kind of analogy. Their systems were designed for conventional generators and typically wind and solar. When you have a battery coming along that's a new technology that has different characteristics, their systems just weren't able to handle it. It was essentially an IT fix they needed to put in, which thankfully came into effect in November. And we have seen since then a lot more activity of batteries in the energy market over the Christmas period, like during times when the system was quite tight, when demand was very high and maybe it wasn't that windy and we were really having to rely on fossil fuel generation. Your system can be at risk then, because if demand is higher than you predict, or maybe if one of your fossil fuel generators isn't able to generate, has an issue, then you might be short of supplies. You might have to actually load shed. You might have to just disconnect some demand, which is not what a system wants to do. So the batteries were able to sort of enter the energy market over that Christmas period and resolve some of those issues because they were there able to supply energy into the market at those peak times. So that's been really important for the industry to see. So I would say, in terms of where we are, we started off very fast. We slowed down a bit now in the middle, but I think now with the energy market opening up and a few other schemes underway that will help underpin energy storage, I think we're going to ramp back up and again be one of those world leaders in terms of energy storage.
Okay, there's two things that come to mind as an engineer. Like, what's the biggest technical challenge that we need to solve? It's probably the one, we need to be working on as a group almost, I would say. And then we get lots of inquiries about businesses, SMEs and multinationals and stuff about trying to put in batteries and stuff. Like, what is the main decision factor you think they need to figure out? Is it worth putting in the battery or is it not worth putting in the battery? Because obviously they're looking at it from a financial perspective most of the time.
From a financial point of view, the economics are certainly better for battery storage today, and getting even better and better because the battery costs, as I've explained, have just come down and down. And at the same time, electricity prices, particularly the peak electricity prices, have gone up and up. And businesses, particularly those who have maybe a site or a space to put in a battery behind the meter, so to speak, are increasingly looking to do that because they're looking to offset particularly that peak demand charge that they face, or the peak electricity price that they would face otherwise, if they didn't have a battery. So we're speaking to a lot of companies now that are now seeing the economics to do a battery storage system, like a relatively small system, but they'll put on their site. And if they have, on-site solar as well on the roof, they can shift some of that energy to the battery during the day and then use it later on to cover their evening peak and thus avoid the highest price that they would otherwise face from the grid. That's a great thing to see. I think that will continue just with, it makes economic sense right now. We're even seeing a lot of households doing that at the domestic level. Like a lot of people are installing battery with their solar. They're almost offered as a package now by a lot of the suppliers. And you can use the battery to offset your solar and kind of balance your energy throughout the day and reduce your electricity costs, essentially. It's actually an interesting one with energy storage at the moment in terms of the technical challenges. So as I mentioned, batteries today can do about 6 to 8 hours comfortably in terms of storage duration. They can store energy and they can discharge it to cover about 6 or 8 hours of, demand. With the batteries that are already, I say we have 1 gigawatt of batteries connected to the system. There's about a further 10 gigawatts in development in terms of planning permission and in the grid connection queue. What does that mean in terms of the system? Those are numbers, but like the peak demand on the system today is about 7 gigawatts. The evening peak, that's the highest demand the system typically sees. So just with the batteries in development today, you could cover that evening peak exclusively with batteries if you had to, assuming they all built out, So that gives you a sense of the scale of the sector. And the technology is there already. Like lithium-ion batteries will do that 6 to 8 hours. So they'll balance solar wind within a day. If you have a lull during like part of the day, the batteries can step in and cover that in terms of shifting excess renewable electricity to that period. Where it gets difficult is the multi-day, even multi-week problem, where again, as I said, if you have an extended lull in terms of renewable electricity, how do you cover that? That is a technical challenge I still see in terms of the energy storage technologies that are available. Like some are just developing, like I mentioned, the Form Energy project in County Donegal, the Energy Dome one in County Offaly. But these are very like new technologies, to be fair. Like they're only starting deploying now, and they're obviously looking to ramp up. In terms of like an off-the-shelf solution, like you can buy a battery today and it'll do 6 to 8 hours, and it's very established. Prices are very secure and stable. It's a well-established industry. Buying in technology that can do 100 hours or a week energy storage is a little bit more tricky from a technical point of view in terms of like readily available technologies, proven technologies that people will finance as well. That's a very important aspect. Investors and developers understand batteries because they've been around for a decade now and they've proven their worth and their costs are, very attractive. So you can get financing for those assets from, a bank or an investor. Harder to do that with a new technology which doesn't have the same track record. It's a riskier investment generally. So what we're doing in Energy Storage Ireland and other countries are doing as well is trying to develop a supportive environment for those sorts of technologies. So we know we need them. We're going to have lots of renewable electricity in Ireland. So we're going to need to store a lot of it and shift a lot of it if we're really going to become, energy independent and a clean energy sort of economy. So how do you do that? We need to develop new storage technologies that can provide that sort of service capability. How do we create a supportive environment for them? It's through policy and through regulation. Route to market is the big challenge for energy storage today. Like planning, not really a big challenge, to be fair. Grid connection is not a huge challenge. It's the route to market. It's how do you get financing to build this asset? That's the big problem, and that's what we're trying to address in Energy Storage Ireland. I'll give you a comparison. So you might be familiar with wind and solar electricity in Ireland. Generally, they are financed through what's called the Renewable Electricity Support Scheme, RES.
Yeah.
Or ESS, that's designed by the government. And that essentially provides wind and solar with a fixed price for a 15 to 20-year contract term. And it's a CFD, so contract for difference. So if the market price is below the strike price for the renewables, they'll top it up to the strike price. So the renewable gets that money no matter what. If the market price is above the strike price, the renewable hands back to the consumer. It's a good balance of risk and reward between the developer and the consumer. That essentially is how renewables get financed. So like a renewable developer, if it gets one of these RES contracts from the government, it's an auction, so they have to compete on price, so the best projects win. But let's say you get one of these contracts, you have a 15-year support at a fixed price. You can take that to a bank and they will give you finance. You can get a good return on that because they understand, okay, we know this is backed by the government. It's not a risky return, so we can finance it. There's nothing equivalent for energy storage at the moment like that. Mm-hmm. So we're energy storage and we're trying to create that same sort of market dynamic where you have an asset that has a value, but right now it's very difficult to get finance for it unless you have that sort of structure in place. And other people call that a subsidy. I don't call it a subsidy. It's just a different way of paying for something. It's price stabilization. So if you think of the energy market, how it works today, where you have this volatility in prices every half hour, like the price is shifting all the time, depending on demand generation in the system. Sure, a storage asset can buy low and sell high, and it can make money that way. But try to forecast that out for 10, 15 years, what the price is going to be. Like, we don't even know what the price is going to be next week. There could be another crisis in somewhere else in the world, and the price could collapse or could double or whatever. So it's very hard to predict that.
It just gives them security on the price, kind of.
Exactly. So you could try to go to a bank today and say, oh, I want to build this energy storage asset, and say, well, how are you going to make money? And say, well, I think the energy price is going to be this over the next 10, 15 years. It's very hard to predict that. You're very unlikely you're going to get finance for that. So what the likes of the RES scheme do is just provide certainty for that investment. And that's what we're looking to do with energy storage.
I suppose on the smaller scale, like that was always a question I had as well. Like, we know PPAs exist for heat pumps and solar and all that, purchase agreements and different finance structures and stuff. But on batteries, it seems like they won't fund them unless they're the smallest portion of a project, usually.
Mm,
Like from a PPA perspective, like they'll do it if it's with solar and something else, but it has to be the smallest part of it. That's
yeah,
been my experience anyway.
yeah,
So
agree.
I suppose for the businesses, is there anything trying to be developed around storage funding wise or PPA wise or anything like that?
You know, that is going to happen. What is a little bit tricky for a lot of businesses is, as I mentioned, like behind the meter, I think it's taking off because people have the sites to do it, and it's economically advantageous to do it, to put in a battery system, pair it with their solar. They tend to be looking at that pretty thoroughly, and that seems to be taking off. Where you have, let's say, businesses that want to do a PPA with wind or solar, that's very straightforward. They'll buy like an annual amount of energy from that wind or solar site, and they'll match it against their annual demand, and they'll offset it that way. Where battery gets a bit tricky is, how do you get the certificate of cleanness from that battery in terms of electricity? So if you buy a PPA with wind or solar, and let's say you're trying to say I'm 100% clean, or I've sourced all my energy from 100% renewables, you can do that quite easily with a wind and solar, because every wind and solar unit of electricity comes with like a cert essentially that guarantees that its origin and its greenness. Right now, we don't have a system in place for a battery to do that. Like, how can you tell what's coming out of the energy storage system is green or not?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Now, it can be done. Like, there are systems and there are companies that do this worldwide, for companies that they're able to prove that, okay, what came in and out of this battery is green electricity. You can use it to offset your demand, and you can get value from that. It's essentially a system that needs to be ramped up in Ireland, because right now it's not really commonplace. I think that would really help corporates be able to generate PPAs and developers be able to sell them if they're able to say, like, this battery and wind and solar paired together, we're able to provide X amount of gigawatt hours or megawatt hours of clean electricity, and therefore you can offset that against your own demand, or if you have a certain amount of carbon emission reduction targets, that you can offset that. So that system, I think, is really interesting. In other markets, it's called 24/7 clean energy matching. I don't think we have a term for it here yet, but that is essentially the way it's going. Like, you would see a lot of corporates buy PPAs with wind and solar in Ireland and internationally, where they're buying it on an annual basis. So let's just say, for this example, our company's demand is 10 gigawatt hours per year. We'll contract with this wind farm to provide 10 gigawatt hours over the course of the year. Like, they don't have to be connected together. Like, the company could be in Dublin and the wind farm could be in Donegal, and they could say, well, we're 100% green because we've offset all our annual demand with production of this wind farm. But obviously, as we know, the demand for that company doesn't match the generation for that wind farm exactly. Like,
Yeah.
it's just not going to be that way. Even more so with solar. Like, the solar isn't going to be generating at night when your company might still be importing electricity. So what companies are trying to do is to move beyond that and say, well, now we're going to buy a PPA that matches our demand every hour of the day with clean electricity. So we're going to be able to prove that every hour of our demand was met by clean electricity somewhere on the grid. And to do that, you need energy storage. There's no other way around it, at least in Ireland. Like, other countries have like lots of hydro and nuclear, and they can do it that way. In Ireland, you can't. Like, we don't have lots of hydro. We're not going to be building nuclear anytime soon. So you need to rely on wind, solar, and some form of energy storage to get to that 100% hourly matched clean electricity. So that's where I see like a market developing for corporate PPAs to try and do that, and a value for energy storage to capture that, because you can think of the highest value for those PPAs will be in the non-wind or solar hours, where the storage has to play essentially.
Yeah, and I suppose they'll be looking to do demand response and arbitrage and all that as well then with that, so
yeah,
it gets a little more complicated then on them.
Flexibility will be part of it as well. Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Yeah. So from the current state in the country, what do you think are the biggest barriers? Is it policy? Does there need to be changes in the sector? What do you think?
Generally, like, we have a fairly supportive policy environment for energy storage. And I can say that, having worked in advocacy for energy storage since 2020, I should say. We struggled at the start to get the regulator, get ministers, for instance, who were in power at the time, to understand energy storage and its use case and the need for it. So we spent a lot of our early years like looking at like evidence bases and doing like good studies, with working with like really good consultants to prove almost the consumer benefits of having energy storage. So we did a report with a company called Baringa in 2022 called Game Changer, because we believe energy storage is a game changer for Ireland's renewable electricity system. And they basically modeled what the system would look like in 2030 once we have more renewables like offshore and solar, but with and without energy storage, essentially. So with energy storage, you're looking at basically a net annual consumer saving of 85 million euro per year in terms of the wholesale cost of energy. That's every year. So, you're talking over the decade, nearly €1 billion in saving. So we were able to use those sort of evidence bases to prove that energy storage was needed. So thankfully, we got over that hump, I think, in the early years where we weren't really understood. And in 2024, the government actually produced an electricity storage policy framework for Ireland. I think we're one of the first countries in Europe to do that, to have actually a national strategy for energy storage. Quite high level, as most strategies are, but it's useful in the sense of setting a direction of travel for the energy storage industry. And it was very positive towards energy storage and the need for it to support like long-term energy security, energy independence, and obviously decarbonization. So that was really important for us to get over the line. And to be fair, like we see a quite supportive government currently for energy storage. The regulator and the likes of our key stakeholders like EirGrid and ESB Networks are quite on board with energy storage. So I think we're in a good space policy-wise. But policy doesn't often move as quickly as we'd want, and I think that's the same with a lot of sectors. So I can't really complain too much just about our, issues there. But I did mention the route to market being the big challenge. Like there are lots of energy storage projects already with planning permission, already with a grid connection offer. And they can deliver very quickly. Like a storage, it's essentially a container with batteries. It's very modular. You could deploy these systems in 1 year to 2 years easy. And so there's a lot of stuff there that's ready to go. What I mentioned in terms of the route to market is the big challenge. Now, we are seeing, luckily, 2 big advancements in that area in terms of providing that certainty for investors that they can get finance over a long term for their assets. So EirGrid last year, due to a large part because of this government energy storage policy framework, have started to develop a long duration storage procurement scheme. So storage of 4 hours plus duration. They're looking to buy this in certain areas of the grid, essentially, because EirGrid recognized like we have a grid problem. We cannot build the grid fast enough to accommodate all these renewables in different areas of the grids. We're going to be wasting a lot of that renewable electricity unless we put in place some sort of solution. So one of the quickest solutions is to deploy energy storage in those areas of the grid. And basically you can resolve a congestion issue, or you can soak up excess renewables and then deploy it to other areas of the country by putting in place that long duration storage solution. And so they're looking to basically buy energy storage in certain areas of the country and with under 10 to 15 year contracts with a kind of a floor price. And that'll allow the storage asset to get essentially finance and develop. ESB Networks are doing a similar thing on their network. So again, just to maybe differentiate, EirGrid is a transmission system operator that they operate like the motorways of the network, so very high voltage, and larger projects tend to connect to the transmission network. So EirGrid are doing that program, and then ESB Networks, which are the distribution system operator, are doing a program on their system level, which is generally low voltage, smaller projects. So they're doing a very similar thing where they're looking to buy energy storage, incentivize developers to develop in certain areas of the country to help alleviate grid congestion, alleviate renewable curtailment, essentially. So that's positive to see, and we're looking to build on those schemes and deliver even more and more energy storage to meet Ireland's longer term needs.
I suppose then, is there any other country maybe that's a bit further along that we could learn something from?
Yeah, 2 or 3 I can point to. So just across the water, GB, Great Britain is quite advanced in terms of their energy storage market. I think they're considered like the world leader in terms of the integration of energy storage onto a grid and the markets that are available there. They've recently developed what they're calling a cap and floor scheme for long duration energy storage. So they're looking at storage of durations of 6 hours and above, and it's open to all sorts of energy technologies. What they're essentially doing is, again, similar to the Irish scheme, the national system operator there recognizes they need energy storage. They're looking to procure this from developers, and they are they're calling it the cap and floor. So they will provide a floor price over a fixed term that the assets can earn. And then there's a cap on the amount of revenue, that the assets can earn above the floor. Any revenue they get above the cap, they hand back to the consumer. So again, it's sort of a give and take arrangement. And then the other market I would point to there, which we think is very good for, in terms of a model, is Australia. And one of their states, New South Wales, is developed a long duration energy storage procurement scheme. So again, Australia is, a unique grid in a way. It's like a massive landmass, but lots of wind and solar and very kind of spread out. So the grid isn't the strongest, you could say. It's a weak grid in many areas. So they're looking at energy storage to kind of put into these areas of the grid to help sort of patch it up. And they have a long duration storage support scheme that's been going for the last few years, and it's been really successful. They've had multiple rounds of it in terms of annual rounds of procurement. They've procured 8-hour batteries, pumped hydro, compressed air energy storage. It's all developing in the coming years to help integrate particularly solar electricity on their grid and displace a lot of their coal generation, which is great.
There's one other side of energy storage I suppose we haven't even talked about is, we got electricity, but like there's also thermal storage and stuff that has been
Yeah.
on the market. And I know the Netherlands have stuff that they're working on and things like that. But is that part of the remit for Ireland, or are we kind of, that's an aside for smaller projects, or what are we doing now?
I think it's part of the remit. I would caveat by saying I'm not necessarily the expert in this. So in Energy Storage
Hmm.
Ireland, we focus on electricity storage.
Hmm.
So as in electricity to storage back to electricity, where it's obviously thermal storage is electricity storage to heat. Like we don't represent necessarily developers or technologies in that space. But
Yeah.
I would say just from speaking to companies, it is a growing area. It's an area that you've obviously pointed to a couple of countries there that are very advanced in this. There's a huge industrial heat demand in Ireland.
Mm.
And how do we decarbonize that? There's a variety of technologies that can play a part there, like just different temperature ranges that like heat pumps can play in. There's electric boilers, there's thermal storage. It's an area that potentially we might get into in the future, and we could expand that way. For now, though, I do see like there is a challenge in terms of how electricity prices are currently structured that
Hmm.
isn't really sending the right price signal to, let's say, a thermal storage developer. Like a thermal storage, as I understand it, you would you take in electricity and to charge your store, and then you'd use that heat at a later point in time for your process, your industrial process. You're not looking for a constant supply of electricity. Data center is pretty kind of flat load profile,
Yeah. Yeah.
whereas a thermal storage user might just, I want to charge this overnight and then use the heat during the day. Right now, the electricity price structure, there's a lot of fixed costs built in, even though the wholesale price of electricity does vary throughout the day. If you're a flexible industrial demand user, you could get a good wholesale price like at night or when the wind is strong. But then once there's a lot of fixed charges that are like the network costs or the capacity costs on the grid that are fixed per megawatt hour, and they don't incentivize any sort of time of use or flexibility in the system. So right now, gas is still a cheaper option for a lot of those companies than actually electrifying with a thermal storage asset. So right now, there are kind of projects being looked at by the regulator and by the department to reform electricity costs to maybe send more of that price signal to the likes of flexible industrial users with thermal storage, which I think would make the economics a lot more attractive for those types of companies and assets.
And then I suppose you kind of alluded to this with that study. Let's say energy storage over the next decade, like how could that change the electric system for us? You said 85 mil was what that study
Yeah,
said it'd be in savings. Was there anything else that is going to adjust over time that we need to be aware of or we need to be planning for?
the big risk is wasted renewable electricity. Honestly, put it in context, we have a system demand today which is peak around 6 to 7 gigawatts. Like that's not a big system, but when you compare it to like the likes of GB, which may be 10 times higher. But anyway, it's 6 to 7 gigawatts here in terms of the peak demand. That's forecast to grow with electrification, with like just natural population growth, more data centers connected to the system. It's forecast to be maybe around 8 to 9 gigawatts by 2030 or beyond 2030 in terms of the peak demand. Like that's the amount of demand the system needs to meet at its maximum. And to put in context, we already have about 5 gigawatts of onshore wind in Ireland. We have about 2 gigawatts of solar. We've got about nearly 5 gigawatts of offshore wind that's contracted or soon to be contracted to deliver post 2030. We want to double our solar. We want to double our onshore again. So there's roughly around 20 gigawatts of renewables that we're looking to build by like the mid 2030s. And that's sort of, you need to overbuild because renewables are variable, so you're supplying electricity at different times. But that means at times we will be over generating, over supplying a lot of renewables, like more than twice our demand on the system. And that's going to come at a cost because developers are going to want to be compensated for that, or it's going to be baked into their price that they bid into these renewable auctions. So how do we solve that problem? Because it'd be a massive cost to the consumer in the future if we don't address it. And it'd be a massive problem in terms of we're going to be wasting a lot of renewable electricity, and we're still going to be relying on gas generation for other times. So we're not fully off gas, and we'll still be exposed to volatile fossil fuel prices, and energy independence will be a question as well. So we see energy storage as being really key to help address both the oversupply and waste of renewables problem and also the residual gas generation problem. So it's a perfect solution that fixes both problems. That study with Bringa that we did as well, it wasn't trying to optimize the amount of energy storage. So we could do further analysis that look at like what's the actual perfect amount of energy storage. For this model, we just said, what's an additional 2 gigawatts of energy storage do? So not even that much more, but it was 2 gigawatts of longer duration. And they showed that could reduce the curtailment of renewables by over half. So reduce the waste of renewable electricity by half and reduce the residual fossil fuel emissions in the system by half as well. And that's really important because by the time you get to 2030 plus, whenever it is, 2035, you've already built a lot of renewables. You've kind of got a lot of the low-hanging fruit out of the system. What's really hard to abate then is the residual fossil fuels in the system. Because you can't just throw more wind or solar at the problem. You're hitting a ceiling. So how, when it's not windy, it's when it's not sunny, what do you do with that other gas generation? And those emissions are really hard to abate. There's not many of them left in the system, but they're really hard to get rid of. So energy storage is really, if you can get rid of half of it just with 2 gigawatts of energy storage, and you can get rid of half the curtailment, that's like, to me, that's a no-brainer. You should press that.
This is back when I was in college. We used to learn about this, but is it still that the grid is very disconnected and focused in almost 2 areas? It's kind of that line from Limerick to Dublin or whatever,
Yep.
Is that still the case, or is there now high voltage going north in Ireland up towards Donegal, all that crack, or is it not that far yet?
It's still the same. Still the same. Grid development has really been a challenge. So most of our grid development, in terms of the large high voltage infrastructure from west to east, was developed in like the 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
And since then, we haven't really done a lot, to be honest. The actual high voltage grid development at the 220 and 400 kV, which are the higher voltage levels, has really been non-existent since then. Very minimal. And there's reasons behind that. There was projects that EirGrid had to develop, they were called Grid Link and Grid 25 back a few decades ago, and they got shelved basically because there was a lot of public and political opposition. I think that sort of narrative has changed a lot now, particularly when you look at the political level and the need for grid. But that's going to take a long time. So we understand that EirGrid are going to be developing a sort of a future networks strategy for what the 2040, 2050 power grid needs to look like. And, presumably that is going to include, new power lines and new high voltage grid infrastructure, like east, south to north, north to south, east west, all that stuff, where renewables are going to be. But it's definitely fair to say that that's not going to be an easy process to deliver. I think even EirGrid would admit that. Like these aren't quick projects. Like they're big infrastructure projects crossing multiple counties and landowners, and it'll be a challenge to deliver. It needs to be delivered, absolutely, but it will be a challenge. So the grid is still disconnected in that sense. Like you've got most of your onshore wind in the west, you've got most of your demand in the east at Dublin. You've got offshore renewables connecting, fair enough, on the east and the south, but you've got transmission problems there as well to deliver that energy where it's needed. So how do we address that in the short term? I would argue that energy storage is not a alternative to grid investment. It is a complement, and sometimes it defers grid investment a bit down the line. So if your ultimate grid that you're going to need is going to be 20 years in the making, if you can deliver storage in less than 5 years and you've got 15 years of benefits, you should do that. And then ultimately they work together at the end of the day.
And then I suppose in your own interest, what is the most exciting things in the energy sector now at the moment in terms of storage? Like they're being developed?
I'd be accused of being biased here, but I really am genuinely really excited about where energy storage is heading. And I think it will be the technology of the century. Honestly, like I've said the word game changer, I've probably used that so many times, but I really do think it is. And the advances we're seeing in batteries, particularly, and in other forms of energy storage are just mind-blowing to me. Every month or so, I see the updates from like some of these international publications or market monitors, and it just always seems to be a further cost decline or an efficiency increase, or like the life cycle of the asset is increasing. Like to give you an example, when I started this in 2020, it would have been typically seen like the lifetime of a battery asset was like 7 to 8 years at the technology. And that wasn't even being like cycled a lot, like charged and discharged a lot. That was sort of like minimal usage. It would last 7 to 8 years. Now, like the suppliers are providing basically like guarantees for 20 years on the project, or that'll last like, I think, thousands and thousands of cycles. That basically they'll guarantee, they'll insure the project or give you a warranty for 20 years in terms of what the battery asset can do. And again, to give you another example, like your standard 20-foot container, which is where your battery systems are housed today, would have housed about 2 to 3 megawatt hours of electricity back 5 years ago. Now it's 8 to 9, so 4 times the energy of storage in the same space, and it's looking to even increase further and further and further. So I really do think a lot of the detractors for renewables in terms of particularly wind and solar would have said you can never really rely on them because they're intermittent, they're variable, they cause grid imbalance challenges, or what about the times when you have to balance it out with gas anyway, so you're not really doing anything. I really think energy storage, batteries and new technologies are changing that landscape very quickly, and people struggle to keep up. Honestly, I think there's policymakers and even the industry people, I don't think fully see what's happening and how quickly this is changing, and it's really exciting to be in. So if we can get the market's right, I think the technologies will be fine. We'll have the technologies to solve the problems, short, medium, long term. Technologies will be there. I'm very confident that if we can just set up a market that allows them to participate fairly and provides that same, financial certainty that we've provided to renewables and gas generation historically, I think we'll be fine. And that's what we need to get established in Energy Storage Ireland. Yeah.
If there's anywhere they wanted to find more information on energy storage, where would you point them?
EnergyStorageIreland.com. Yeah. We produce a lot of good information, reports, publications on energy storage benefits, use cases, where the sector is at. We publish a pipeline survey of the state of the industry, sort of like how many projects are out there, where they are, what's in development. So if people want to find out how energy storage is doing, check out our website or follow us on LinkedIn, Energy Storage Ireland. On LinkedIn, you'll get our regular updates there.
And just to wrap up, normally at the end of every podcast, we do this thing where we ask you if you would like to ask a question out to industry. And someone from our last podcast has left you a question. So is there any question you would have for industry?
Yeah, I'm particularly interested in AI and how that is going to shape the electricity industry, how it'll help like efficiencies in the use of electricity. So you could say a lot of electricity isn't used efficiently today in terms of, we're wasting some renewables, or maybe there's like devices or technologies that aren't being used to their maximum capability, for instance. So I wonder how AI is going to change that look or that system.
No. So how AI will change the efficiency of the energy systems. And
yeah, I'm kind of curious about it. Yeah. It's a better way of putting it.
And then the last person left this question: how can businesses in our sector work better with local communities when developing new projects so the community gets real benefits?
So I have a few thoughts here. So engage early and often is often like the mantra that people use. Like, let people know what you're planning, what you're doing, answer questions on that. Like, they're working with the renewable industry. Like, there's different ways of doing this, whether it's town halls or like virtual events, or like, the events where you can see almost like a visual representation of what the project will look like, and to answer questions. There's door-to-door stuff. So that stuff is important. People want to feel included, like they have a say, like their voice matters, because it definitely is a negative when like a project is seen to be gone under the radar or above people's heads, for instance, and is now suddenly in planning. Like, there obviously is a planning process where people can put in objections and queries on things, but I think it's good for developers to try ahead of that potential issue and engage early and often in the process. There are certain things that are mandated through the likes of the renewable support schemes in terms of community support payments and benefits, which I think are important. But I think it's also really important to highlight that it can often be seen as like a very local, national thing, or divide there in terms of like certain renewables located in counties and where the electricity is ultimately going. I think it's important to frame that in two ways. Like, ultimately, we all use electricity, so like it's a national issue we're trying to solve. B, we're trying to create a cleaner, more sustainable, affordable economy, and we're doing that through wind, solar, and batteries. Essentially, that's to me the workhorse of our energy transition in Ireland. It's going to deliver more affordable, more stable electricity bills. It's going to deliver cleaner air, and I think the third thing I was going to say is it delivers jobs and local investment. So the renewables industry, including energy storage, is a whole of Ireland economy in terms of, lots of the contractors, OEMs, developers are located in various areas of the country, rural areas of the country. They develop projects there. They create local jobs. We even did an analysis with KPMG, with Energy Storage Ireland, that you can find on our website, that estimated, if we build out the volumes of energy storage that Ireland is going to need for post-2030, it will create 5,000 indirect and direct jobs in energy storage alone in Ireland. I think that's really important. Like, it creates local investment, it creates local jobs for communities and economies, these renewable developments, because it is very decentralized. So you think of the older style power system where you had large conventional power generators and a handful of them connected with transmission to demand. Whereas now we're looking at like multiple of renewable projects at a smaller level located around the country, creating local investment, local jobs, and local opportunities in each area. So it is a much more decentralized sort of, I think, fair energy transition than what we would have previously seen under the sort of, let's say, the fossil fuel reign.
That's great. Anyways, Bobby, we're going to have to probably cut it there, but thanks so much for joining us. And it was really interesting, all the insights into, the energy storage sector and how it's playing in Ireland's energy transition. And thanks for everyone listening.
Thanks very much, Dylan. Cheers. Thanks for having me.
If you would like to find out more about what we covered in this episode, you'll find notes, links, and more in the description area of this podcast. Do remember to press follow for our show so you get the next episode automatically. Also, please do share with a friend who you think would find it interesting. Just tell them to search for The Energy Canvas with Celtic Dynamics on their podcast app. Our podcast today was produced by dustpod.io and brought to you by CelticDynamics.com. Until next time, thank you for listening.